While we're waiting for Dr. Klein's slides to load, I wanted to make sure everybody noticed that there's a change in the schedule today, and you can get the updated information outside. Basically, we're starting the afternoon session at 1 o'clock instead of 1:20, and everything's slightly accelerated so that we will end the day earlier than we otherwise might have.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank Virginia and Irina for inviting me to this very exciting symposium/workshop. Quick outline. I'm going to do a little bit of history, starting with some personal history, and then talk about the different possible bilingual advantages. And I'm going to end with some lessons from history. So I want to begin with why I'm here, which might not be that obvious. I'm a cognitive psychologist. My primary area of interest is in attention. I like to think of myself as a neo-Hebbian in the sense that I'm interested in trying to understand how the brain implements mind. I have a long-standing interest in reading and dyslexia, but as I noted, attention is really my primary interest. And I've tended to shy away from language because my linguistic intuitions are not that good. I spent my 2000-2001 sabbatical half-time at the Rotman Research Institute, to which I had been invited by its then director, Don Stuss. And as it turned out, my office was next to that of Ellen Bialystok, who was also on sabbatical at the Rotman at the beginning of her collaboration with Gus Craik. And primarily because of my interest in inhibitory processes and cognition, generally, and attention more specifically, and my expertise in the Simon effect, I got invited into their exciting collaboration that was exploring the possibility that early mastery of 2 or more languages might provide in later life an improved inhibitory control system. And I'm sure many of you know that this 2004 paper became a seminal one for stimulating a huge amount of research in the decade and a half since it was published, and for the topic of this conference. Anyway, in 2010, I encouraged my first-year graduate student, Matt Hilche, to write a term paper for a course that I was teaching on applied cognitive psychology, and I suggested the topic, Costs and Benefits of Bilingualism. My encouragement was based on curiosity, because while I was aware of the 2004 findings and had, I'll say, advertised them in 2 of my publications, one a textbook that I Canadianized, Ashcraft's book in Canada, Ashcraft and Klein, and in another article that I had written about the relation between attention and the Simon effect. I hadn't closely followed the literature that had been stimulated by that paper, so I thought it would be interesting to get my student to tell me what had happened, because that would be faster than me doing it. And just as an example, here are a few of the things that I said in those 2 papers. Prior to Hilche's analysis of the literature, which was circa 2010, published in 2011, I was an endorser of the idea that bilingualism could generate general domain improvements in executive function. As you will see, however, and to quote Randy Engel, I was wrong. So Hilche's term paper was refined and transformed into this review that was recently mentioned. More recently, Hilche, Jean Saint-Aubin, and I updated that review for a chapter we contributed to the Cambridge Handbook of Bilingual Processing that will appear in print this August. And recently I presented a précis of both reviews in a commentary that I wrote on Virginia Valian's very nice Target article on this topic. So members of the audience may know a little bit about the Hilche and Klein review, but because it hasn't appeared yet, the information in the chapter will be new to most of you, and therefore I'm going to focus on that today. But first, some history, not my personal history. So I wrote this in the piece I wrote on Virginia's article. Scholars and educators were once concerned that encouraging children to learn more than one language might have adverse cognitive consequences. And for some linguistic capacities, fluency in vocabulary, this is often true. Unfortunately, such individual costs might discourage governmental policies that are aimed at fostering multilingualism despite its widely acknowledged societal benefits. Peel and Lambert in 1962 helped overcome this concern, and through her myth-dispelling efforts and prodigious empirical output, Bialystok has pushed the pendulum of opinion in the opposite direction. And partly because I got roped into this field, I have read Peel and Lambert, who said some very interesting things. And I'm just going to read what's on the screen. This is a quote from their paper. "The picture that emerges of the French-English bilingual in Montreal is that of a youngster whose wider experiences in two cultures have given him advantages which a monolingual does not enjoy. Intellectually, his experience with two language systems seemed to have left him with a mental flexibility, a superiority in concept formation, and a more diversified set of mental abilities, in the sense that the patterns of abilities developed by bilinguals were more heterogeneous. It's not possible to state from the present study whether the more intelligent child became more bilingual or whether bilingualism aided in his intellectual development, but there's no question about the fact that he is superior intellectually." So let's highlight the caveats that are in this interesting summary. First of all, they were careful to say that, well, this is what's true in Montreal. Secondly, not just bilingualism, but maybe a wider experience in two cultures was playing a role. And perhaps most importantly, did the more intelligent child become more bilingual? This reminds me of the comment that Randy Engel made yesterday when discussing the possible connection between working memory capacity and second language acquisition. It makes the idea of reverse causality a likely explanation for many positive findings. In any event, as a result of Peel and Lambert, mental flexibility became a catchphrase for describing the nature of the cognitive advantage that bilinguals might enjoy over monolinguals. While arguably more specific than intelligence, this term, mental flexibility, is primarily descriptive and doesn't tell us much about what cognitive representations or mental processes might underlie the better scores on the particular tests they used. A bit later, Cummins admonished the field and told us that a theoretical framework for relating language proficiency to academic achievement among bilingual students was needed. Now, we might not have expected Peel and Lambert to have generated such a theoretical framework because at the time of their writing, the cognitive revolution was still in its infancy. But as I see it, the most influential effort to follow Cummins' admonition was made by Bialystok in her book, Bilingualism in Development, Language Literacy and Cognition. Bialystok's review of the post-Peel and Lambert findings led her to the following description, which places a considerable emphasis on the concept of selective attention achieved through the inhibition of task-irrelevant information. Here's the that was a summary of the empirical results. This is a theoretical statement. But if both languages are active, then how do speakers or listeners or readers manage to maintain performance in only one of the languages without suffering from massive intrusions from the other? According to some researchers, the explanation is that there is a constant inhibition of the non-relevant languages, allowing the desired system to carry out the processing. This inhibition is undoubtedly achieved by means of processes carried out in the frontal lobe. If this model is correct, then bilingual children experience extensive practice of these functions in the first few years of life, at least once both languages are known to a sufficient level of processing to offer viable processing systems. It would appear that this practice in inhibiting linguistic processing carries over to processing in highly disparate domains. As noted by Kroll and Bialystok a few years ago, the past decade has seen an explosion in the amount of research that addresses language and cognitive processing in bilinguals. I think this very clear and exciting proposal from Bialystok's important book provided a key stimulus for this explosion of interest. So too did a variety of findings subsumed under the heading of neural plasticity. And adding fuel to the fire, of course, were the positive results from the seminal study in 2004. So the question I want to address is, are there extralinguistic cognitive costs and/or benefits of multilingual exposure and mastery? And there's two qualifiers in that question. One is we're talking about cognitive costs and benefits. This is to exclude the possible economic, social, and cultural costs and benefits. In my opinion, in the vast majority of cases for which families make a decision to either become or for their children to become bilingual, the benefits far outweigh the costs. That is, the non-cognitive ones. And we use the extra-linguistic to exclude from consideration the potential linguistic benefits, such as meta-linguistic awareness, and costs, such as vocabulary, of multilingualism, which are relatively well documented. So, if you will forgive the metaphor of the gymnasium, so we presumably have a lot of exercising of cognitive processes in bilingualism, perhaps more than in monolingualism. We'll address that later. And we could ask what kinds of cognitive processes are exercised in the bilingual gymnasium. Well, in Ellen's book, the one that was highlighted particularly was the idea of selection via inhibition. But preceding selection is the idea that you have to monitor the context in order to ensure that the language selected is the correct one. And I'm no expert on this, but I did find this lovely picture from Edward's book. It's from Rubin, illustrating language choice in Paraguay as a function of context. And if you just run through this, you'll see there's quite a lot of monitoring and decision-making that needs to be made to figure out what language one might speak. Of course, switching is something that happens frequently when you're a master of 2 languages or more. I think I'm going to focus a little bit on switching, but there's not as much evidence on it as there is on monitoring and selection. Now, it turns out that the Hilchi and I made up abbreviations for these things, at least 2 of them. We referred to BICA as the bilingual inhibitory control advantage, BEPA as the bilingual executive processing advantage, and now I'll talk about the bilingual switching advantage as well. And because of Albert's talk, I don't need to say too much about what we might be looking at in the data to explore BICA, BEPA, and BSA. In the seminal 2004 paper, the key rationale, which was rooted in the proposal of Green and later in Bialystok's book, was a model based on inhibitory control in which the non-relevant language is suppressed by the same executive functions used generally to control attention and inhibition. If this model is correct, then bilinguals have had massive practice in exercising inhibitory control, an experience that may then generalize across cognitive domains. To test this hypothesis, the Simon effect was selected for 2 reasons. Firstly, like the famous Stroop effect, the Simon effect is thought to be due to conflict between 2 simultaneously activated responses. The task-relevant, automatically activated tendency to respond in the direction of the stimulus, and the task-relevant response that depends on the identity of the stimulus. But secondly, unlike the vocal linguistic Stroop effect, the Simon effect is non-linguistic and uses manual responses. Finally, it's often assumed that participants who are more efficient at inhibiting task-irrelevant prepotent responses would show smaller Simon effects. When Hilchi and Klein in 2010/11 reviewed the considerable number of studies that were spawned by the exciting hypothesis of a bilingual inhibitory control advantage, BICA, and by the positive support for it provided in the 2004 paper, we found a methodologically variable and empirically messy literature. To give you a guide to this figure, studies are oriented vertically, and the results are presented as a dot on a horizontal line, where if the dot is on the right side of the line, that would be a bilingual advantage, and if the dot is on the left side of the line, that would be a monolingual advantage. So with regard to BICA or BICA, I was clearly wrong. As noted by Bialystok et al. In the 2004 paper, and later by Costa in his papers, bilinguals were faster as well on congruent trials. While what we thought we had uncovered in our 2011 review was that this finding of a global advantage, we call this a global advantage, BEPA, in contrast to the overall absence of BICA, was a robust one. Although we introduced BEPA as theoretically neutral in the discussion, we did offer a concrete idea that linked it to the conflict monitoring system. So BEPA came to be associated with enhanced monitoring, and we prematurely, as I will show, concluded that the relative ubiquity of the bilingual advantage in global RTs provides strong support for the BEPA hypothesis. A few years later, John Schweider invited me to contribute a chapter to that handbook I mentioned earlier, and I thought that an update of the 2011 paper would be timely because so many new studies using the non-linguistic conflict tasks covered in the previous review, that's Simon, Flanker, and Spatial Stroop, had appeared since then. So I teamed up with Hilche again and my colleague from University de Moncton, Jean Saint-Aubin, to review this literature and write that chapter. We discovered 31 new experiments that used Simon, Flanker, and Spatial Stroop tasks, 18 of which tested monolingual and bilingual young adults, and those studies are illustrated here. The measures that targeted BICA interference effects closely replicated what we had found in 2011, essentially no evidence for a bilingual advantage. Just note the red line represents the mean, unweighted effect from the 2011 review, and the dots are just the new studies since 2011. The double arrow at the top represents the range of scores from the 2011 review. Here, I've added in blue a few studies that have appeared since we conducted the follow-up review. So even though the chapter is going to appear in August, of course, studies have been conducted since we submitted the final version. In any event, on the left-hand side, the BICA results are pretty much unchanged. But on the right-hand side, where I've plotted the results from the global advantage, alleged advantage, BEPA, we can see that there's been quite a dramatic shift in the outcomes. The solid red line represents what Hilche and I had discovered in the 2011 review, and the arrow on the double arrow on the top represents the range of scores from that review. The dashed red line represents the unweighted average of the effects published since 2011. So no BEPA either. We can ask what happened to BEPA that seemed so robust in 2011. An anonymous reviewer of our chapter suggested that data in the years preceding 2011 may have tended strongly towards bilingual processing advantages because of publication biases or outcome reporting biases, et cetera, and suggested that perhaps the widespread popularity of the bilingual advantage idea discouraged researchers from attempting to publish null effects, and maybe the Hilche and Klein review, which was challenging to at least some of the ideas about bilingual advantages, facilitated publication of null results. So we agreed in the chapter that biases might account for the divergence between the pre- and post-2011 research reports, and we suggested that the bias hypothesis warranted a more formal mathematical and complete treatment. Just such a treatment by De Bruyn et al. Recently appeared in Psychological Science. Converging evidence led them to conclude that this literature is biased. Our overall our overview shows that there is a distorted image of the actual study outcomes on bilingualism, with researchers and media believing that the positive effects of bilingualism on non-linguistic cognitive processes is strong and unchallenged. For a salient example of such a bias, in this case against reporting null results, consider this footnote from Pryor and McWhinney's study of task switching, which until I conducted the analysis of literature for today's presentation, I didn't realize had this footnote in it. Essentially, there were null results from flanker task and assignment task in Pryor and McWhinney's study, but those were not reported in their paper, other than in this footnote. When we conducted the 2011 review, we recognized that task switching had a substantial surface similarity to switching between languages, that it might be reasonable to hypothesize that bilinguals would be more efficient at switching between tasks than monolinguals. At that time, however, there were scant studies, really only Pryor and McWhinney, that could be used to test the bilingual switching advantage hypothesis. Now, however, no doubt stimulated in part by the positive results reported by Pryor and McWhinney, there is a substantial core of such studies with local switch costs reported for almost all of them and global switch costs reported for most. So we look at local switch costs, which Albert described earlier as in a block where they're switching, what's the difference between repeat trials and switch trials? These are the results. Of the 18 studies, 4 reported a mathematical difference favoring monolinguals, while 13 reported differences favoring bilinguals. There was one tie at 0. If you are a true believer in the proposition that bilingualism leads to executive processing advantages, BSA in this instance, I recommend you restrain your enthusiasm. First, in contrast to the pattern with local switch costs, of the 12 studies reporting global switch costs, 8 found a monolingual mathematical advantage, while only 4 found a bilingual advantage. And based on the correlational results that Albert described in his talk that preceded mine, it would seem to be the global ones that ought to be showing the advantage. Second, consider the implications of de Bruyn's conclusion that the literature is biased. They specifically said, and I think they were criticizing Hilche and Klein to a degree, our overview shows the number of actually conducted unpublished null effect studies and suggests that the results of a meta-analysis can, in fact, be affected by such a bias. Third, Annette Pryor, whose study with McWhinney launched this literature on BSA, found no bilingual advantage in either local or global switch costs in her 2 most recent papers. And in her most recent one, concluded, importantly, bilinguals in the current study were not found to outperform monolinguals in any of the components of executive function. And finally, consider what we learned from Ken Papp's poster yesterday. Fourth, almost none of the mathematical differences that I've showed you were statistically significant. I was really only considering whether they were positive or negative. And fifth, in Papp's very large N study, there was no evidence for a BSA, much like we heard from in Costa's talk. So let's summarize. Despite multiple biases, which I think begin with, we'll call it the confirmation bias, there's publication biases, there's reporting biases, that favor publication of positive findings for bilingual advantages. Our analysis, or our analyses of a huge swath of the pertinent literature has revealed no BICA, no BEPA, and no BSA in young adults. Essentially no bilingual advantages in inhibitory control, in monitoring, or in switching. I focused in this presentation on young adults, but our 2 reviews suggest that similar conclusions apply across the lifespan. That is not to say that bilingualism does not uniquely configure the central nervous system or that the executive network is not affected by bilingualism. And we've seen many neuroimaging studies, including some slides in the most recent presentation, that illustrate such differences. But a different neurocognitive architecture should only be considered cognitively advantageous if it translates into objective measures of performance differences, and we haven't seen any. So one might ask, why are there no such bilingual advantages in the studies I've reviewed? As noted by Papp and Greenberg in 2013, the demands on executive functioning associated with managing two languages may not appreciably exceed those involved in speaking a single language. And I quote from their paper, "Within a single language, conversational partners must monitor for signals regarding turn-taking, misunderstandings, possible use of sarcasm, and change of topic or register. Similarly, monolinguals must incessantly make choices among activated lexical candidates during production and suppress irrelevant meaning of homophones during comprehension. If general cognitive control mechanisms are required for the monitoring, switching, and conflict resolution required within a single language, then it may be the total amount of language use, not the number of languages, that determines the degree to which language enhances executive function." So I want to end with some lessons from history because I seem to see things repeating a little bit. Well, John Edwards basically said that what we're trying to do here is really important, that is, look at the relationship between bilingualism and intelligence, or we could say the more modern term, executive function. In commenting on the hundreds of studies circa 1980, the mid-80s, that compared the performance of bilinguals with monolinguals on various measures of intelligence, Hakuda noted that different researchers were working under different sociological circumstances. They differed in what moved them to look at the relation between bilingualism and intelligence. In the first place, they chose different methodologies that reflected their motivations, and their motivations markedly influenced their interpretation of their findings. It is difficult to overstate the importance of the zeitgeist in which the scientist works. Early in the last century, that zeitgeist was decidedly pessimistic. Here's a quote from Jesperson, 1922. "It is, of course, an advantage for a child to be familiar with two languages, but without doubt, the advantage may be, and generally is, purchased too dear. First of all, the child in question hardly learns either of the two languages as perfectly as he would have done if he had limited himself to one. Secondly, the brain effort required to master two languages instead of one certainly diminishes the child's power of learning other things." We don't know where these ideas came from, but that gives you an idea of what the ideas were like at the turn of the 20th century. Peel and Lambert's landmark study, The Cognitive Revolution, Exciting Ideas About Neuroplasticity, Bialystok's concrete proposal, and new sociocultural forces laid the groundwork for a dramatic change in zeitgeist to a much more optimistic view, a view in which exposure to two or more languages might bestow a variety of extra-linguistic cognitive benefits. In line with this more optimistic zeitgeist, and as I noted in my commentary on Valian's article in Brain, Language, and Cognition, there is an exciting narrative here that meshes nicely with adages from both popular culture, use it or lose it, practice makes perfect, and contemporary cognitive neuroscience, neurons that fire together, wire together, derived from Hebb's cell assembly theory. Like many other scholars, I too wanted to believe that the answer to this question is yes, but alas, it is not. Our belief in a yes answer is rooted in wishful thinking and biases that operate at every stage of the scientific process. So in conclusion, this doesn't mean that we're out of a job. As noted by Fishman in 1970, there's still plenty of work to do. He said, every conceivable relationship between intelligence, we can read that as executive processes, and bilingualism should obtain. Our task is not so much the determination of whether there is a relation between the two, but of when, in which socio-pedagogical contexts, which kind of relationship, positive, negative, strong, weak, interdependent, or not, obtains. Thank you.